I was 15 when it happened. It was a cold Friday night in late September when my parents had gone out to dinner, leaving me home alone. I invited my best friend and neighbor, Chris, to come over. We usually played games or watched movies in the basement, but that night we were bored. Out of nowhere, he suggested we play hide and seek. It sounded childish, but we turned off all the lights except for the one in the kitchen to make it creepier. The rules were simple. No going outside, no attic, no crawl space, everything else was fair game. At first it felt like just another dumb game, but once the lights went out, the house didn't feel the same anymore. Chris wanted to hide first, so I stood in the living room, covered my eyes, and started counting to 50. I could hear his footsteps rushing across the floor at first, but after a few seconds, the sound faded into silence. The quiet made the house feel bigger than it really was. When I finished counting, I yelled, "Ready or not, here I come!" and started looking. I began in the kitchen, but there was nowhere to hide. Just the fridge humming softly and the clock ticking on the wall. I checked behind the basement door, peeked down the hall, opened the bathroom door. Nothing. I even checked the small closet by the front door. Empty. So I headed upstairs, each step creaking under my feet, making the silence feel heavier. I checked my parents' room first, half expecting Chris to jump out and scare me. Nothing. I looked under their bed, behind the dresser, even inside the closet, still nothing. My room was next, but it was too messy to hide in without leaving a trace, and yet I still looked. Under the desk, behind the clothes, on the floor, in the closet, nothing again. That left the guest room at the end of the hall. The door was cracked open just enough to make me stop. I pushed it slowly, waiting for him to jump out, but the room was dark and still. I stepped in and bent down to check under the bed. Empty. I opened the closet door. Also empty. At this point, I was convinced he was in the basement. I went back downstairs, the air growing colder as I opened the basement door. I checked behind the washing machine, under the stairs, even behind some boxes in the corner. Just when I was about to give up, I saw him, curled up behind a stack of boxes, grinning. "Dude, that took you forever," he said, laughing. I rolled my eyes. Yeah, whatever. My turn. He covered his eyes and started counting. I ran upstairs and crawled under the guest bed, pulling the bed skirt down around me. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. A few minutes later, I heard Chris's footsteps moving around downstairs, slow and deliberate. Then the creaks on the stairs. He was coming up. The sound grew louder, each step dragging slightly, like he was taking his time. I heard him open my parents' bedroom door, then the bathroom, then silence. The floor creaked again, closer this time. He was in the hallway. I could hear his breathing when he stepped into the guest room. My chest tightened. His shoes shuffled near the bed. Then, nothing. Just silence. I held my breath for what felt like minutes until I finally heard him walk out. I waited a little longer, just to be safe before crawling out. The room looked exactly the same, only darker now. I went downstairs, ready to brag that I'd won, but Chris wasn't on the couch. I called out, "Game's over, man!" A voice shouted back from the basement, "I'm down here!" I froze. He was down there? That didn't make sense. I opened the basement door and shouted down, "You can stop now! I'm out!" He yelled back, sounding out of breath. "Where are you hiding?" My stomach twisted. "What do you mean? I'm in the kitchen," I said. Seconds later, Chris came up the stairs looking confused. "How did you get upstairs so fast?" he asked. I blinked. "What are you talking about? I was under the guest bed the whole time." His face went pale. "I checked that room," he said quietly. "I heard someone breathing." For a second, neither of us spoke. I laughed nervously and said, "You're messing with me," but he swore he wasn't. We argued a little, then shrugged it off, trying to act like it didn't bother us. We played another round, but the tension lingered. Every little creak made me flinch. At one point, while I was counting, I heard a soft thud upstairs, like something heavy falling. When I went to check, the rooms were empty. I found Chris hiding in the laundry room, and we decided to stop playing. We sat on the couch and turned the TV back on, trying to shake off the weird feeling. Then out of nowhere, there was a loud bang from upstairs. Something falling. Hard. Chris turned to me, wide-eyed. "Parents home early?" he asked. "No," I said quietly. The hairs on my arms stood up. We waited, but the house went silent again. Chris tried to laugh it off, saying maybe something slid off a shelf, but before I could answer, we both heard it. The slow creak of floorboards. Footsteps. Someone was walking down the hallway upstairs. We stared at each other, neither of us moving. I whispered, "Maybe we should check." He shook his head fast. "No way." But the sound continued. Step, step, step. I grabbed the fireplace poker from beside the couch and motioned for him to follow. The air was so still I could hear my heartbeat. We moved up the stairs one slow step at a time, every board groaning under us. When we reached the top, I froze. The guest room door, the same one I'd left open, was now shut tight. My throat went dry. Chris whispered, "It was open before." I nodded. From behind the door came a faint dragging sound, like fabric sliding over carpet. My hands were shaking as I raised the poker. I took a deep breath and pushed the door open fast. The room was dark, the faint glow from the streetlights spilling through the blinds. Everything looked normal. The closet door stood half open. I stepped closer, every instinct in me screaming not to. Chris stayed by the doorway, whispering, "Dude, don't." I yanked the closet door open. Nothing but coats and boxes. We both let out shaky laughs, trying to act cool. "See?" I said. "Probably just the house settling." But before we could even move, we heard another sound, this time from downstairs. The front door creaked open, then slammed shut. My heart dropped. Chris whispered, "Someone's in the house." We ran down the hall, ducked into my room, and turned off the lights. I held the poker tight, trying to keep my breathing quiet. At first there was nothing. Then, faint footsteps moved across the living room floor. Slow, careful, like whoever it was knew we were listening. I wanted to call the cops, but my phone was downstairs on the couch. I whispered to Chris that maybe we could escape through the window, but it was too small. The footsteps stopped near the base of the stairs. Then the basement door creaked open. We heard the steps descend. 1, 2, 3. Until they faded away. We looked at each other, both realizing this was our chance. We bolted. We ran as fast as we could down the hall, down the stairs, through the kitchen, and out the back door into the cold night air. We didn't stop running until we reached Chris's house across the street. His parents were home, and when we told them what happened, they immediately called the police. The officers came within minutes and searched every corner of my house. They found nothing. No sign of forced entry, no open windows, no footprints in the basement dust. It didn't make sense. Later that night, when the cops left and my parents finally came home, I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever was there never really left. For weeks, every time I walked past that guest room, I felt it, that same cold stillness in the air, like something had been disturbed, like something was waiting for the lights to go out again. They told us it was probably just the house settling or maybe our imaginations running wild after playing in the dark. But Chris and I both knew better. We knew what we heard. The footsteps, the door, the dragging sound on the carpet. Someone had been in that house with us for weeks after. I couldn't sleep. It was every creak in the floorboards made my heart race. Every shadow in the hallway made me hold my breath. That was the last time I ever played hide and seek. I guess we were too old for it anyway. Chris and I never really talked about it again, but every once in a while, when our eyes meet, I can tell we're both thinking the same thing. Remembering that night when hide and seek turned into something else. Every years later, I still think about the sound of that closet door creaking open, the slow drag across the carpet, and those footsteps downstairs. We never found out who it was. Or maybe a burglar who realized we were home. Or maybe someone who slipped out when we ran. Or maybe someone who never really left. I grew up in a neighborhood that sat right next to a thick stretch of woods. The houses lined one side of the street, and behind them was nothing but trees for miles. As kids, we spent every weekend playing outside, sometimes until our parents yelled for us to come home. Our favorite game was hide and seek. It was fun during the day, but at night the woods turned into something else, dark, endless, and impossible to tell one tree from another. That was what made it scary, and what made it exciting. The last time I ever played was when I was 14, on a hot August night with 4 of my friends. We thought it would just be another game. We were wrong. Jason volunteered to be it first. The rest of us scattered into the dark. I ran with Tyler toward the woods, and once we passed the first line of trees, we split up. I ducked behind a fallen log, my heartbeat pounding in my ears even though it was just a game. Back in the yard, I could hear Jason counting, his voice echoing faintly through the night air. When he reached 50, his voice stopped, and the whole world went quiet. The only sounds were the crickets and the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. I crouched lower, trying not to move, barely breathing. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Soft, steady, moving between the trees. I thought it was Jason. I stayed perfectly still, waiting for him to pass. The steps stopped just a few feet away. Whoever it was didn't call out or move again. They just stood there. I could feel my skin crawling, every nerve on edge. I almost whispered to ask who it was, but I stopped myself. If it was Jason, I'd lose. So I waited. After what felt like forever, the footsteps started again, this time heading deeper into the woods. I listened until they faded away. When the silence returned, I peeked over the log, but it was too dark to see much. The moonlight barely reached the ground. After a few more minutes, I decided I'd had enough. I stood up and began walking back toward the yards. Just as I reached the clearing, I heard Jason yell that the round was over. I jogged out and found everyone already gathered. Jason had found Tyler and Eric, but not me or Matt. A moment later, Matt came stumbling out of the woods, laughing, his shirt covered in dirt. "No one was ever going to find me," he bragged. I laughed and told them Jason had almost caught me when he walked right past my hiding spot. But Jason looked confused. "What are you talking about?" he said. "I never went that far into the woods. I only stayed near the fence." I froze. "Then, who was it?" I asked. Everyone just shrugged. We joked about it, called me paranoid, and started another round. This time, I was the seeker. I pressed my face against a tree, counted loud, and then started searching. I found Eric hiding behind a shed, and Tyler crouched in the bushes. Then I moved into the woods to find Jason and Matt. The forest was quiet again, just the hum of bugs and the occasional snap of a twig under my shoes. My flashlight beam cut through the trees in shaky arcs. After a few minutes, I spotted Matt crouched near a tree trunk. "Got you!" I yelled, and he ran off laughing toward the yard. That left Jason. I wandered deeper into the woods, calling out for him. That's when I heard it again. Those same footsteps. Slow. Heavy. They came from just ahead of me. I shined my light, but the trees were too thick. I crept forward carefully, the leaves crunching softly under my feet. The footsteps stopped. My throat went dry. Then Jason called from behind me, saying the round was over. I spun around. He was already walking toward the yard. "Wait," I said. "Weren't you just in front of me?" He frowned. "No, man, I was hiding near the house the whole time." My stomach turned cold. Twice now, I'd heard someone walking in those woods who wasn't one of us. We tried to laugh it off, but it didn't feel funny anymore. Every time I hid after that, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. I kept hearing faint noises, twigs snapping, leaves crunching where no one should have been. Once I even thought I saw a shadow move between the trees, tall and human-shaped, but when I pointed my flashlight, there was nothing there. The others didn't seem to notice. They just kept laughing and running like nothing was wrong. I forced myself to keep playing even though my hands were shaking. For the last round, Jason wanted to hide in the woods again. We all groaned but followed. I didn't want to go deep this time, so I stayed close to the edge, crouching in the tall grass. The faint glow of porch lights shimmered between the trees. I could hear Jason counting in the distance. When he stopped, the world went still again. Minutes passed. Then I heard something that made my blood run cold. A whisper. It was low, broken like someone mumbling under their breath. Too quiet to understand, but close. Way too close. My body locked up. I lifted my head slightly, scanning the darkness, but there was no one. The whispering stopped, replaced by slow footsteps moving past me. I stayed completely still, my chest tight, my ears straining to follow the sound. The steps faded deeper into the woods, and then Jason's voice broke the silence, calling that the game was over. I walked back slowly, my heart still hammering. Everyone else was already in the yard, laughing and brushing dirt off their clothes like nothing happened. I told them I'd heard someone whispering, but they just laughed and said I was trying to scare them. I didn't argue. I just sat down, still shaken. A few minutes later, as we sat in Tyler's backyard drinking soda and catching our breath, Matt suddenly asked, "Hey, did anyone else see that man?" The words hit like a punch. We all looked at him. "What man?" Jason asked. Matt's face was pale. "In the woods," he said quietly. "While I was hiding, I saw a man standing between the trees. He wasn't moving. He was just watching us." Jason laughed nervously and said he was imagining things, but I could see the fear in his eyes too. Eric joked it was probably a hiker or someone's dad. But I did, because deep down, I knew Matt wasn't lying. I'd felt it all night. That heavy silence, those slow footsteps, that whisper in the dark. Even now, years later, I still think about that night. We all thought we were just playing hide and seek, but someone else was playing too. We ended the night soon after, but I couldn't sleep. Lying in bed, I kept hearing those whispers and footsteps echoing in my head. I never played hide and seek in the woods again. Even now, when I hear leaves crunch under my feet at night, I think of that man Matt said he saw, and the sounds none of us could explain. Him or stranger, it was something else. But when you hide in the dark woods, you never really know who's hiding with you. It was a hot Saturday afternoon last July. I was 14, living in rural Pennsylvania, with a backyard that stretched for acres, open fields, tall trees, and an old shed by the woods. My friends and I were playing basketball by the garage when we saw a kid we didn't recognize walking up from the dirt road. He looked older, maybe 16, with messy black hair and a gray shirt despite the heat. He smiled and asked if he could join, to even the teams. None of us knew him, but he said his name was Keith and that he lived up the road. We didn't think much of it then, but we should have. We all looked at each other, confused. I'd lived here my whole life and never once seen that kid before. Neither had my friends. But Keith acted so casual, like he'd always been part of the neighborhood. When Ben asked if he wanted to play basketball, Keith just shook his head and said we should play manhunt instead. He smiled and said my backyard was perfect for it, with so many places to hide. None of us thought much of it at the time, but looking back, how would he even know that? Still, we agreed. It sounded fun, and we were bored anyway. We split into two teams. Keith immediately volunteered to be one of the seekers, saying he loved hunting people down. It made us laugh, but there was something strange about how he said it. So it was Keith, Adam, and Josh hunting, and me, Ryan, and Ben hiding. When Adam kicked the soccer ball to start, we all sprinted in different directions. Ryan ran toward the tree line, Ben ducked behind the garage, and I decided to hide in the old storage shed by the woods. It smelled like gasoline and old wood inside. I spotted a pile of folded tarps in the corner, climbed underneath, and held my breath. 10 minutes passed, though it felt like an hour. Nobody came. The silence was heavy, just the distant hum of insects and the creak of the shed walls in the heat. Then suddenly the door creaked open. Before I could even move, the tarp was ripped off me in one quick motion. I flinched, then sighed in relief when I saw Adam laughing. "Got you," he said. We walked back to the patio, joking about how bad my hiding spot was. A few minutes later, Ben came out too. He'd been caught behind the garage. Soon after, Josh returned. But Keith didn't. At first, we thought he was still out there, maybe playing around or trying to scare us. 10 minutes passed, then 20. Adam finally said maybe he'd just left. It was weird, but we shrugged it off. When the guys left around sunset, I went inside. That's when I noticed something near my window, a piece of rope lying in the grass. Old, frayed, dirty. I knew it hadn't been there earlier. I picked it up and tossed it aside, but it stuck in my mind. I couldn't stop thinking about Keith, something about the way he'd appeared out of nowhere and disappeared just as suddenly. That night, I got ready for bed around 11. My dad had already gone to sleep. I was lying there scrolling on my phone when I heard its soft, slow footsteps outside my door. My body froze. My dad sometimes got up at night, but he always coughed or cleared his throat. This was quiet. Too quiet. I called out for him. No answer. The footsteps stopped right outside my room. My heart pounded. I got up slowly and locked the door. I stood there, staring at the handle, waiting for something to happen. 30 seconds passed, and then I heard the front door close. The sound echoed through the whole house. I bolted to my dad's room and shook him awake. He grabbed his shotgun from under the bed, still half asleep but alert. We searched the whole house. Every room, every closet, even the basement and garage. Nothing. He went outside with a flashlight, checked around the shed and the edge of the woods, but there was no one. We locked every door and window after that. The next morning I told my friends. They laughed it off, saying Keith was probably just some weird kid trying to scare us. But Ryan admitted something that made my stomach twist. He said Keith barely talked the whole game. He just stared. That night, I couldn't sleep again. Around 2 in the morning, I heard a soft scratching sound. Slow, steady against my bedroom window. My chest tightened. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't stop myself. I reached up, lifted one of the blinds just enough to peek. A figure was standing inches away on the other side of the glass. I couldn't see his face, only the outline of a tall body, motionless in the dark. My heart jumped into my throat. I stumbled back and screamed for my dad. He grabbed his shotgun and ran outside, firing 2 warning shots into the air. He yelled into the night that he'd shoot whoever was out there if they came back. When he came back in, the figure was gone. We stayed awake the rest of the night with every light on in the house. By morning, neither of us had slept. My dad told me he believed it was Keith, the same kid who showed up out of nowhere, who somehow knew my yard like he'd been there before. We never saw him again after that day, and every summer since, whenever I walk past that old shed, I can't help but feel like someone's still watching from the woods. My dad said that if that kid ever showed up again, he'd shoot him. I knew he didn't mean it literally, but he meant it enough. He told me that Keith was never welcome anywhere near our house again. And as far as I know, he never came back. Still, sometimes when I'm outside at night, I can't help but think about that rope I found by my window. It was old, dirty, and tied at one end, like it was meant for something. I try not to imagine what he might have been planning if I hadn't woken up when I did. Have you ever met someone who gave you that same uneasy feeling, like they were hiding something dark beneath the surface? Tell me in the comments. I'd love to hear your story. And if this one made your heart race, don't miss the next scary true hide-and-seek horror story waiting for you on the channel.